Well, hi everybody. This is MMT and the Public Purpose. I'm one of your hosts, Joe Firestone, and your other
And
okay is Lisa Theobald.
hi,
And
everybody.
our guest for tonight is Sherry Wise. Uh, I think your formal title is a senior economist. But is that true,
Yeah,
Sherry?
senior economist. Yeah,
Okay, and you're in the Department of Agriculture.
correct.
And what is the subdivision of the Department of Agriculture that you're in?
I work at the in the agricultural marketing service, and
Ah,
it's a really broad agency. It covers a lot of stuff. So we have grading, and we have like organic certification, and all kinds of stuff, and market news. We deal a lot with prices. So we'll be talking about
price.
prices tonight.
Yes, we're talking about inflation once again. And
And
so
Yep.
once
that's our
again,
topic for tonight. And the reason why we're talking about it is because Sherry requested that we talk about it because there are a lot of people babbling about it. And we thought that maybe we ought to do something about the babbling. And so we are going to, at this point, turn it over to Sherry to begin curing the babbling.
I don't think we're going to babble here,
Well,
Joe.
as Joe said, I've been kind of, seeing various conversations about inflation. And of course, since this is an MMT community, but there's a lot of important information that really doesn't relate to modern monetary theory, except at a more foundational level, I guess. But I think it would be good to explain some of this, some of what's going on with inflation, and in particular, I wanted to focus on agriculture because so much of what is going on with inflation right now we're seeing in the agricultural sector, and so I wanted to talk about some of these things, talk about how these things influence prices, and just kind of give people kind of a primer on or primer on how prices move in markets when when there's various changes that are going on. And so what I did was I developed a bunch of slides.
Good.
So
Oh, you think that's funny, huh?
I'm sure nobody else thinks it's funny, but somehow I just like graphs.
That's all right.
Visuals are
So
good. Visuals are very good.
yeah. So I wanted to, just kind of talk about some of this stuff, and Joe will be putting his graphs up.
Okay, shall I begin to
And
share them?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, what we have is the Bureau of Labor Statistics every month puts out um, data on they gather data on prices that have been paid in different areas of the country, and they put this information together into let's see, could you go to the very first page, Joe? Yeah, that's it.
Consumer price
To what
index.
we all know as the Consumer Price Index. Now, this is a graph of a consumer price index, and they're using the period of 1982 through 1984 as the base period. So prices in that period would basically have an index of 100. And so these, what this shows is that we are, let's see, we have been over the period of 2016 to 2020, prices were about 2.5 times what they were in a broad sense in the base period of 1982 to 1984. And then last year, we saw a pretty good jump, about 20 points. Now, this year, we're seeing another jump. Um, and so, this is indicative, when we have ongoing uh, price changes like this, it's indicative of inflation. So that's a
Uh,
general
just to
rise in the
clarify
price
this,
in prices. I'm sorry?
the red line going across the stream is the average CPIs for 2016 to 2020 from January to December. So you see
Correct.
that the red line is it rises a little bit over that period, but it's fairly constant, as you
Correct.
see. Okay, then the dotted line is 2021. What happened in 2000? Okay, in 21, and you can see that starts out at roughly a CPI of maybe 262 or something like that. That seems to be what the visual, okay, is showing. Okay, and it's going up to something like 278 at the end of the year in December. So there was a substantial rise compared to 2016
Mm-hmm.
to 2000, okay, and 20, but
Mm-hmm.
a much less substantial rise than we see in the period of 2000, okay, and 22, where it starts off at roughly 278 and it's already gone up to, I guess that's approximately 296. So the rise for 2022 is a lot sharper than for 2021, and the rise for 2021 was a lot more substantial than the relatively flat line for 2016 to 2020. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. Thank you for explaining that better than I did, Joe. um, it, you need to have friends sometimes to help you out.
Yes,
Okay.
friends help a lot.
So what this shows is that certainly since the beginning of 2021, we see prices continuously increasing, and they appear to be even increasing at a more and more rapid rate. Okay, so what I wanted to do was talk about just the kind of the basic economics of what's going on in a market.
Sherry, did we lose you?
I think she's frozen.
Yeah, I think so too. She had a little difficulty before too, but I'm sure she'll be all right if she leaves for a minute, then comes back in.
Yeah, go out and come back in, Sherry, if you can hear us. Here, I'll type it in the comments.
Okay, good,
In the private chat.
right.
Oh, there she goes. There we go.
Okay, there
my,
you are.
my apologies.
That's all.
Um, okay, so we need to go to the second slide, and what I'm going to show you on the second slide is um, just a simple, basic market graph, and that graph really could represent, any market.
Okay, here we are.
There we go. Okay, so we have, as economists, we have the price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, and what we see is we have a demand relationship, which is typically seen as downward sloping, meaning that as price goes down, people can afford and are willing a commodity. And as price goes up, it's the opposite. They can afford less and they're often willing to buy less of it. So you have a negative relationship with the demand curve. But on a supply curve, you have the opposite. And so with the supply curve, the higher price goes, the more industry is willing to supply because you'll have new firms moving in, or they divert resources from other areas and stuff. So the supply curve has typically an upward slope. And where, this is your basic econ 101 demands and supply curve, where demand and supply intersect is where we have what economists call the market equilibrium. It'll reach a price and a quantity that, in the market basically will be a market clearing price, and we'll be able to sell whatever is supplied. So that's your basic market. So do you mind going to the next slide, Joe?
Not at all. Here we are. That's
okay. So in the
increase in
next slide, yeah, what we have is an increase in demand. So what this means is there is some kind of change in the market that occurs, and it could be for a lot of different reasons. But it's on the demand side of the market, meaning that people who are purchasing the commodity, something's changed on their end, and it could be that their income has gone up. It could be that, say, this is a market for Merlot, and that movie, what was that called? Sideways, about a wine snob going through Napa, and he's talking about Merlot. Well, if you didn't like that movie, maybe your demand curve for Merlot might go up. So preferences change, preferences change. It could also be that you like steak, but steak has gone up in price. So now you're going to buy chicken more. And so this could be the demand for chicken. So lots of things can affect our demand for a commodity. Like I said, it could be preferences, it could be income, it could be other prices. And so what typically we see when demand increases in just a basic simple market model like this is that the demand curve shifts forward, and it actually reaches an equilibrium at a new point, which is at a higher price and a higher quantity. So as a result of this new situation, people now want to buy more Merlot. And so if and so what happens is there's a lot more Merlot, being sold, and people don't even mind if they have to pay a little bit more for it because their preferences have changed.
I see, because they just love Merlot.
Yep, that's right. Actually, I do, but
Well, how about chicken? I love chicken.
Yep, chicken's good too. And so what has happened? Some of what we saw over the course of the last couple of years is we saw some changes in demand that came about, and really for different reasons. So of course the demand for like hand sanitizer went way up, and um, and also the demand for food that we purchase at a grocery store actually went up because restaurants were shut down for a while. And so that changed the way we buy things. And so And so what happened was there was like a different mix of foods that we saw at first, through as a result of the pandemic, uh, and the measures that were taken to follow up with it. So we had a certain amount of that. Now, one thing that a lot of people talk about, and of course MMTers disagree with, and I disagree with, is that there is an idea that there was a lot of money pumped into the economy. Um, and so, for instance, I saw a Farm Bureau report where the author said that on average, the American households got 11,000 and some dollars during the course of the pandemic. Well, I know I didn't see any $11,000.
Yeah, I didn't see any $11,000 either. Where did that come from?
Yeah. Lisa, did you get your $11,000?
No.
Low.
Somehow we're getting ripped off. But actually, I think what happened, and as I think we all know, is that a lot of that money didn't go to households. It went to businesses. It went to wealthy people. It went to buying off bad assets, things like that. And so there was probably some increase in demand as a result of some of the stimulus that was brought on by the pandemic, or that was given out as a result of the pandemic. But of course, that didn't last very long. A lot of people didn't get anything. And a lot of people, they were just using the money to pay bills because they couldn't get to work anymore. So I would say that demand is probably, for your average commodity, has probably not been impacted that much by the money that was pumped into the economy. Because for one thing, a lot of the money, some of the money went to the wealthy who aren't going to spend it. Some of it went to people who, lost their jobs and they needed it for just basic living expenses. So, anyway, so let's go to the next graph.
Sure.
Okay, so now I'm going to look at the supply side of the market. And what we have here is this is going to seem kind of counterintuitive because of the way it's moving. We actually have a decrease in supply. Right. And the reason why it's a decrease in supply is that as you move along that demand curve, you'll as the supply curve moves along that demand curve, what happens is that you can see that price goes from the price star, which was our former equilibrium, to now price new, which is a result of the new supply curve. Basically, this is the kind of thing that happened all over the place as a result of the pandemic. For one thing, of course, we had a lot of businesses that were just shut down during the shutdown. So no production was being made. And then we had a lot of people who were sick. And so they normally might have been able to go to work and be productive. But a lot of those people became sick. And unfortunately, too many people died. And so in those jobs that those people, hold, those things, if they are involved with producing some kind of a commodity, there's a good chance that the sickness affected the production of that commodity. And certainly we saw this at, I work at the USDA in the Ag Marketing Service. I focus on livestock. And we certainly saw this in livestock because one of the things that happened is one of the first industries to get really, really, really slammed by COVID was the meatpacking industry because people work closely together and they're kind of, all there. They're like facing each other. They also have to wear uniforms. They wear outfits with helmets and coats and things like that. So they can't wear their regular clothing during work, so everybody changes in, so they'll all go change in the changing room, and of course they take that stuff off when they're taking a break. And so, there's a lot of activity where people are, close to each other, or they're maybe, doing different things, not really intimate per se, but, there's sort of activity, and it's easy for people to touch, or at least, they're in the same room together. And
breathe on one another.
yeah, right.
They're far too close for comfort.
Right. And so what we saw in the early days of the pandemic was there were really actually a lot of the packing plants closed down because they couldn't staff it. They couldn't staff them. And so that was an instance where the supply of meat was reduced. We also at the same time had unusual things happen because we also had a mix of meats that now were being bought, because people don't necessarily go to the store, say to buy a filet mignon. They're more likely to buy a filet mignon when they go to a restaurant, because they'll have professionals that can cook it properly and things like that. A lot of people just don't have the cooking skills to be able to duplicate restaurant meals, and so a lot of those products, there was just a change in the mix of like the products that were available and the products that people wanted.
And then the products that were being consumed because we shut all the restaurants down.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And we had all kinds of things going on there that were upside down.
Right. Many. Okay. All right. So now one thing. Okay. So let's go to the next slide, if you don't mind, Joe.
I don't mind at all. Let me let me get to the next slide. Right. So,
okay.
One is monopoly.
Yeah. So those other graphs that I was talking about, they were what you might consider to be perfectly competitive markets, or reasonably competitive. They don't have to be perfectly competitive, but reasonably competitive. But one of the things that anybody who knows me has been hearing about for years now is that we've had a lot of concentration in the agriculture industry. And of course, we've had concentration all across the economy, but we especially feel it in agriculture. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about what impact a monopolist can have on this kind of thing. So monopolies, they face a demand curve, but they don't really have a supply curve, because basically a monopolist can set price or quantity. And so, for instance, if you look at, say, OPEC, that is a cartel which operates like a monopoly. And what they do is they determine, Saudi Arabia will determine how much they're going to pump, how much oil they're going to pump. And so they fix the amount, the quantity, and then let the market price vary depending on demand. And so in other industries, they might fix the price and then let the quantity vary. But we don't have in a monopoly situation a typical supply curve, because basically the monopolist just decides what they want to produce and how much. So for the economic analysis, how we typically look at it is, instead of a supply curve, we see a marginal cost curve. And that marginal cost curve, which is the red line going up, it would actually be pretty similar to a supply curve in a more competitive market. But the but it isn't necessarily what the monopolist is going to offer, because they're going to see how they can get the most money out of it. And so what they do is basically, I don't know how much to get into this, because I know a lot of people won't have had the economics, but basically what they do is, they look to see, okay, if we buy more, if we sell more of the commodity, if we want to sell more of the commodity, what do we have to do to price, to be able to sell more, or vice versa. So anyway, what happens is the monopolist actually faces a slightly different result, which is, rather than the demand curve, they're facing a marginal revenue curve. And that comes out of them assessing how much more revenue they can get from each output.
Hmm.
And here, what happens is the marginal cost curve actually does not intersect with for the equilibrium outcome. The marginal cost curve does not intersect with the demand curve, which we might normally have if this market was competitive, and we would end up with price star and quantity star. Instead, what happens is the monopolist knows that at that point where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect, that is a quantity that they can sell. And they can then charge a higher price, which, basically they would be able to charge price P monop, which is, above the price star in the graph.
Yeah.
So so yeah, so what this is just showing is that monopolists, they have a lot more control over the market, so they can't just necessarily charge anything they want. um, but so they do have to consider what people can afford and are willing to buy, which is what the demand curve reflects. But instead, what they're going to do is they're going to look at, okay, if we increase output, how high can price go? And so that occurs at the point where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. But then we take that price and we basically take it up to the demand curve to actually determine what the market price will, what the monopolist price will be. Okay, so this is confusing. So let me know what questions you have.
Hey, Joe, can you move the graph down just a little bit so we can see the margin, so we can see the key down below?
How's that?
What is the dotted line? What is that dotted line representing?
Oh,
The
that
marginal
dotted
revenue
line.
code.
Okay, the blue dotted line is the marginal revenue curve. The other dotted line is just a guide. So
Right.
the one that goes from price from the curves to price and quantity that are dotted, a kind of a dotted gray. Those are not particular curves. They're just like, it's just kind of like a guide.
It's a visual to show you where it's intersecting.
Right.
But what is this first? Okay, we've got quantity star. We have this quantity out here. What's the first one?
The first what?
Joe, scroll down just a little bit so I can read what the x-axis is saying.
Sure. There we go.
Okay, Q monopoly,
Mm-hmm.
quantity, and then quantity star, and then quantity out. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so this is the problem of monopoly. Or really, anytime you have market power that a company has influence over both the price and the output. What will happen is the firm will set a price that maximizes their gains, but it actually is going to be a price that's higher than the competitive market would have been.
So
And that means,
basically what they're doing is they are going to determine some place between where your equilibrium hits, where the solid red and the solid blue intersect,
mm-hmm,
and where the P monopoly and the Q monopoly hit further up on your
mm-hmm,
demand curve.
right,
And somewhere in between those 2 points, they will make a determination as to how many people they're going to price out of the demand
mm-hmm,
and how much higher they can
mm-hmm,
raise that price to
mm-hmm,
offset the demand that they're basically willing
mm-hmm.
to disregard the market share.
Right, right,
In other words, too bad, so sad, you can't afford it, but there's enough of them that will.
right,
That's
exactly.
what that is.
Yeah. And so what happens is whenever you have a monopolistic situation like this, there, I mean, I'm not saying there always is, but you know, pretty much there's gonna most of the time you're gonna see prices higher than the competitive market outcome might have been, and output lower. Okay.
Correct.
And so
Correct.
what this means is you essentially have a certain amount of welfare that, in other words, say a certain amount of returns, um, returns to society that basically get scooped up by the monopolist, and
Mhm.
the average person doesn't get it. Now we
Yeah.
call that, economists call that consumer surplus. I'm not going to get into that at this point in time, but it does. But what does happen is you lose. I'm sorry.
The consumer surplus is a very nice name.
It's an interesting term, isn't it? It's an interesting term for we've
Yeah.
decided we don't need you. We have a surplus of consumers. We're going to price you out of the market where we don't have to produce as much. It doesn't cost us as much to put out. We'll just raise prices and there will be enough of the market that will bear the price. They're
Hmm.
controlling the whole thing,
Yeah.
i.e., monopoly.
Yeah. See,
Yes.
because they're
Consumer,
covering their.
consumer surplus is a nice name, actually, for monopoly power.
Well, it's actually something different, but in it's important here because it does help us understand that there's basically a shift in welfare of society, because people can't get as much as they want of a good, and they have to pay more, and so
Mm-hmm.
there's basically a shift in welfare. Or, I mean, we can just say it what it is. It's excess
Siphoning.
profits going from the consumer's pocket to the monopolist.
Yes.
Inflation.
And so,
Right. Or it's when you don't have the ideal market, you have excess profits going to the people who have the market power.
right.
And this graph shows the excess in price which
Hmm.
the monopolist can
Hmm.
charge
Right.
if they want to.
Right. Right. And so so what this is one of the reasons why monopoly is terrible. Well, maybe I shouldn't say necessarily terrible, but more often than not terrible.
Oh, it's terrible. You can say terrible.
Sometimes there are some
Unethical.
industries that, because of their cost considerations, they're what we call natural monopolies. And back in the good old days, when I was young, we used to regulate them. So, for instance, like power plants and wastewater facilities and things like that. You know, these things were considered to be natural monopolies, meaning that they're much more efficient to run at a really high production level. But but if you regulate it, then you can keep the price reasonable, so that the consumer doesn't isn't burdened by excess costs, especially when you have things like electric power plants and trash pickup, things like that. These are things that everybody has to pay for, and if people get taken advantage of, they can be seriously hurt, even die because of lack of access to some of this stuff.
Or lack of maintenance of the infrastructure because you're cutting corners to
Hmm.
create profits. And
Right.
there's something I really want to point out here that I just want to put a cherry on top of. When you are able to price people out of a market, right? Excess
Hmm.
consumerism, right?
Hmm.
And we just decide that we're going to let go of a piece of that market share because that's
Hmm.
what consumers are to corporations, right? We don't need this piece of the market share.
Hmm.
What we will do is raise the prices to price people out of being able to consume those goods, right?
Hmm.
Produce less, offset that production with just higher price points. And really, what you're doing when you're doing that is sucking the money out of
Yep.
the state, the macro, right? Or the micro. You're sucking it out of the people
Yeah.
and siphoning it up in through the profits, which is
Yeah.
what we've got because of all of this consolidation. There is so much, and I call it regional monopoly because I think it's really easy for people to get hung up on this idea that, oh, we have all different kinds of healthcare um, uh, industries, right?
Hmm.
We've got what's in California, Kaiser. I've got UPMC here. You've got
Hmm.
Blue Cross and Blue Shield all over the place. But it's
Hmm.
really important to understand that they are controlling regional markets,
Hmm.
right? And
Right.
that's what's happening with the price of healthcare. They've got a stranglehold, a literal monopoly on a regional market sector.
Hmm.
And therefore, they can charge whatever they want for that health care. And
Hmm.
what's everybody's problem right now? I can't afford my health care. Yes, because they've priced you willingly out of the market.
Right.
So, just to also further emphasize this, let's talk about the pharmaceutical sector,
Okay.
where we give pharmaceutical companies uh, but something but close to, well, actually, it's a monopoly, not a natural monopoly, but a patent monopoly.
Yeah.
So we give a patent monopoly, to Pfizer for its particular drug, and Moderna, uh, and so they are able to set the price of those drugs, and they set them high enough to maximize their own profits, which
Hmm.
price people out of the market.
Hmm.
Uh,
Correct.
okay, or would price people out of the market, except for the fact that the federal government was buying a lot of supply from them, so people were able to have the vaccines. And the federal government tolerated overcharging for the vaccines,
Hmm.
in spite of the fact that they had given the patents to the drug companies in the first place. So
Yeah.
that kind of circle seems particularly, particularly extractive, and particularly
Yeah.
egregious.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
also there's the fact that
that,
of course all these companies that have patents, they're constantly badgering, lobbying Congress to extend their patents and yada yada yada. So and so and then also another thing that's really, I think, egregious about it is that most of the basic funding for the research that these drugs were developed from was
Done by
paid
the
for
federal
by the
government.
federal government. So so these are pretty egregious things. But you bring up a very important point about drugs too that I want to show in this graph, but we have to use our imagination a little bit here. Now, suppose that demand curve is actually more more what's the is more
You mean it's more of a vertical curve.
yeah, more of a it's more vertical. Okay, it's not totally vertical, but it's maybe more vertical. Okay, if that demand curve is more vertical, that's what we call an inelastic demand.
Yeah, yes.
An inelastic demand, they tend to be things that maybe either people don't buy a lot of, like say salt, or things that they really need, like medication. And
Right.
so,
Life-saving medication.
Mm-hmm.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are a diabetic and you need to take insulin, your demand curve is pretty much just a straight up and down line, because you have to have a certain amount of, of insulin to survive. So what that means is when you have a monopolist and you have an industry that has a generally inelastic demand curve, like food, like healthcare, medicine, things like that, that actually makes it a lot more like that actually gives the monopolist even more of an advantage
To
because
extort.
yeah, because what happens is, yeah, they can actually, if this demand curve was actually steeper, that was the word I was looking for,
Steep.
um, steeper, you would see that that price would actually come up, and quantity might go down, um, and so that's why things like healthcare are so important. Uh, why it's such a travesty that we have private medical care and then it's dominated by monopolies.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that can happen is it's a little harder to see in this graph, but let me just say this: monopolists or industries where there's market power, they also have a lot more ability to discriminate in pricing. So, for instance, some people have a more inelastic demand curve, and some people will have a less inelastic demand curve. So, for instance, if you're on an airplane and you're a traveling on a vacation, chances are your demand curve for airline air tickets is probably going to be fairly elastic because you only have so much money and you have a lot of other things that you want to do on your vacation. However, if you're a business traveler, you're gonna, chances are the company's paying for your ticket and you maybe really have to be there to sign important papers or whatever. You're gonna have a more inelastic demand curve. And so what you see is, of course,
Business class.
yeah, business class. And then
Mm-hmm.
also we have these lovely things like paying for blankets. And if you want to buy any food, these are all ways of basically sucking money out of you. Um, and so price discrimination is something that monopolists are much more easy to are able to do than firms in competitive markets. Because if you're in a competitive market and you try that stuff, people will just, fly with another guy. So anyway, I'm sorry. Did you have a question, Lisa?
No, I'm sorry. I'm battling these two kittens that we just got last week. All they want to do is knock my camera off of my computer. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. So as I said, and we've talked about this multiple times before. In the late 70s, early 80s, we had a complete transformation of antitrust policy. And as a result of that, we basically haven't been enforcing it very well. We've allowed many, many mergers to occur. And so we now have an economy that's rife with monopolistic firms in every industry, and in some industries more so. Um,
Right.
so,
And the pandemic, one of the effects of the pandemic was to drive a lot of small businesses out,
Hmm.
absolutely
also to
correct.
have further concentration
Hmm.
with respect to large businesses.
Right.
And private
Absolutely.
equity got their hands into things that they've never had their hands into before,
Hmm.
like uh, real estate ventures coming in, buying up hospitals,
Yep.
and you know, forcing those hospitals to bear the burden of those transactions by trying to be profitable in providing health care, while now taking on a whole new leasing commodity, which is the hospital that they weren't paying rent to
Hmm.
be in that hospital. And if they can't be
Yep.
profitable because the equity stake there has put their backs against the wall, well, they don't care, right? You can't
Hmm.
be profitable running the hospital. I
Hmm.
own the hospital and the real estate it sits on, and we're just going to do a fire sale on you,
Yeah.
right? We
Right.
shut you down. We own the property. We tear the hospital down and do whatever the heck we want with it, because they usually sit right in the middle of metropolitan areas, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Or and in rural areas, they've just shut them down.
Yeah, they just shut them down. They don't even want them
Yeah. And
because
so,
that drives the traffic and the uh, business to the bigger hospitals.
right. And so, what you're saying, Lisa, is that that red line, the marginal cost curve, is going to get shifted back, and so it's going to be like we had in that previous thing, and you can get to the point where costs increase so much that, like you said, they can't the firm can't afford to operate anymore, and it shuts
Hmm.
down. And then a lot of times what these private equity people do is they sell off parts or whatever.
Hmm. Hmm.
But they've pocketed all that extra money that they've now forced on the on the firm. Okay, so
Right.
what's happened is that we have had increases in demand in some cases. We've had decreases in supply, and then we have this, this these markets that are highly monopolized, and so all these things tend to push prices up, and so we're you know we're seeing these things now. Let's go to the next graph. And here, what I wanted to do is I wanted to show this is what happens when supply is fixed. So, for instance, when you have a situation like in the
Hey, Joe, can you
pandemic.
put this, excuse me, just a second. Joe, can you just put the graph on a full screen and blot us out for just a second?
Yes, I believe I can.
Because I'd just like to be able to see the whole thing without having to do it piecemeal.
Okay. I'll put it on the full screen layout for you.
It's still the dimensions. I still can't see the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any way I can do that. Hang on a second. Let me see if this helps. I don't know if it will, but it still doesn't cover the whole thing.
You could probably bring it down a little bit.
Oh, I can bring it down all right, but that's going to constrict the upper areas.
Yeah. So this is an
I can
example.
hang on a second. I can bring it down a
Okay.
little bit.
So, okay, so we've got
This is
equilibrium is your price star and your quantity star. Price
Yeah.
down, price up, demand down. Okay.
Yeah. So what I'm showing here is when we were in the pandemic, there were a lot of and things shut down. There were a lot of products that we only had access to what was immediately on the market. So in other words, supply was constrained. We had
Yes.
one amount. So you went into the grocery store hoping to get toilet paper
Mm-hmm.
and you find out, oh, they only had so many, and now they're not there any, and now it's not there anymore. But what what I wanted to show is what happens with the supply curve when the supply is fixed, because we did see some of that in the pandemic as well. And so if demand goes down when supply is fixed, well, what's going to happen is all the change is going to occur on the price side, and you'll have a good lowering of price. Um, but if demand goes up, as we see um, on the other case, in the D up line, well, what happens is price goes up, and again, depending on the elasticity of demand, in other words, how much slope there is in the demand curve, we can see really big changes in price, or not so much, you know, if demand is not as responsive. So and this is the kind of case where people can get into price gouging, which is even higher prices, and that's illegal or should be. Um, and but even when even if it's a say competitive market, even um, if demand is flexible, um, you can still see that prices can go up, um, and they could go up rapidly. So we had some of this going on as well. So and if you could go to the next slide, Joe.
Sure
So
can.
so what I oh so what I wanted to show just is that the all all three of I mean, oh, no, all four of the above kinds of things were things that we saw in the pandemic and afterwards. And of course, part of the problem is the pandemic, has went on for so long. But on top of it, um, we saw these various various countries would have an episode of, okay, there's the pandemics. Sorry, now COVID's really bad in this particular country or this particular town, and so if you were getting goods supplied from those areas, there's going to be a hiccup.
Mm-hmm.
So all these things have led to are some of the things that have led to prices going up. So now I want to get into a little bit more about agriculture, but maybe before I do you guys have any questions? Do we need to go back and follow up on anything?
No, I think so
I think
far as
we
I'm concerned, it's very clear, Sherry.
Okay.
let's just check real quick at the comments and see if people are
Okay.
following along here. People talking about kitties. Let's see. My cousin had small. I don't see anybody asking any questions. If you guys got any questions, now's the time. Otherwise, we're going to move on here. Looks good.
Okay. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about agriculture and what's been going on specifically in agriculture over this time period. And this diagram is a map, and it is a map that is called a drought monitor. It is put out by the USDA and NOAA. And what it does is it shows, if you could scroll up maybe a little bit, Joe, I don't think we really need the dates.
Okay, we don't need the dates.
Nah, we don't need the
Okay,
dates.
There
also,
you go.
Yeah.
when we
There you
talk
go.
of NOAA, we're talking of what, Sherry?
The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And NOAA is the primary weather, it's the agency where the National Weather Service is located.
Okay.
And, but NOAA and USDA work a lot together because weather, of course, is extremely important in the farm industry, in the farm sector. Um, and what we have here is, unfortunately, I'm sorry, I didn't copy off the legend for this, but what it shows is whenever the whenever the map is colored like yellow, orange, red, or dark red, that means that those are areas where it's more dry than it should be. It's more dry than on average. And the darker the red, the more dry it is. And what we see here is that basically about 60% of the United States is in some kind of drought. It may not all be bad, but actually a lot of it is pretty bad. We see a lot of problems in Texas and the Southwest, um, some in Kansas and Nebraska. We also see it in Utah, Nevada, California, and Oregon. And these are all actually very these are all areas that produce a lot of
Mm-hmm.
of food products, and in particular, especially in the Southwest, in the various places, there's a lot of livestock that has been produced, and so what's happening is these regions are actually drying up, and a lot of cattle are moving out of Texas because with climate change, things have gotten so temperatures are rising. We're not getting enough water in important places. And so there's basically no feed for animals in a lot of these places. So they have to move them to other locations. But in addition, if these are these are also areas where crops have been grown in the past. Cotton is one thing. Cotton production is going to be down like I think 28 or 38%. Can't remember which, but it's a big chunk of cotton production that's down this year. And we're also seeing yields being impacted in regular crops. And of course, um, I just heard on the news tonight that, in fact, things are getting so dry in Arizona, uh, Colorado, that the West, that they're actually looking to cut water allocations for, and
Rationing.
it's going to hit agriculture hard. I'm sorry, Lisa, you said something?
Rationing. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
They're rationing the water
yeah.
in a lot of places. They're also rationing the power grid because it's so hot that the draw on
Mhm.
the energy is unbelievable. But I also saw that there are livestock that are actually, it was so hot in some places that they were dropping dead over the last couple weeks.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we see things like this happen. We've seen this happen in Australia too, and they're a big beef producer. They've had years when they, their crops were devastated. And California, one of the things is not only do they not get rain, are they not getting rain, they're not getting to the snowpack as well, and so they're getting, they're not seeing enough. Not only when the weather's hot, they're not seeing enough precipitation. When the weather's cold, and you normally think you would see precipitation.
Well, yeah, and
Okay.
then when you don't have that snow melt, your rivers dry up too.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
And we're seeing
And
that, of course.
yeah.
Hmm.
And also you can't see it here, but a big area of the middle section of the United States um, is overlays something called the Ogallala Aquifer, which is a gigantic underground lake or water source, gigantic, and that is being depleted over time as well.
And that
And
cleans the water. right?
Mhm.
Because it's flowing underground and through all the, it's a natural filter for the
Uh-huh.
water to get
Yeah.
all of that out of it.
Yeah.
Because I think we've all probably heard that the rainwater is no longer potable, supposedly. So yeah, big problem.
Yeah, and a lot of the Ogallala Aquifer has been used a lot to irrigate land in the middle part of the country. And so once the Ogallala Aquifer dries up, um, and I'm not sure when that's going to be. It'll probably be a little while, but we've been putting pressure on it for decades. Um, when that Ogallala Aquifer gets at least low enough, we won't be seeing irrigation in some of those parts of the middle part of the country. And but but one of the things you brought, well, you didn't bring it up, Lisa, but what you said reminded me is that when we do irrigate with with this land, these things, over time there is an accumulation of salt in the land,
Yes.
and so
Hmm.
we're getting serious problems with salinity in many of these dry areas because they normally have been irrigated, and now um, and now some places are becoming too salty for the ground, for the soil to provide nourishment to
Yeah.
plants. So this is a really big deal in terms of our agricultural production, and this, of course, is due to climate change. Um, and so climate change is also increasing our costs. So if we could go to the next slide, Joe.
Of course. Who's working on climate change?
Now, what I was saying about animals is reflected here. This is a graph that shows um, every week the USDA checks to see what percentage of land, of pasture land and range land, is what the quality is. And so what this shows is that from 2016 to 2010, we saw um, an increase over time. Some of this is seasonality, but we saw some increase in the number of sorry, in the percentage of land that is being reported as poor or very poor. Um, and so what that means is that this, say, for instance, in 2010, 20, sorry, 2020,
16.
yeah, 2016 to 2020, um, we saw in the later parts of the year, almost 30% of land would be considered to be poor or um, or very poor. Now, those that later the later in the year it gets, the less of an issue that is, because it starts to get cold. The animals go inside, or they're fed. But what's happening is that this measure has been increasing over time, and so now more than half, sorry, almost half of the land that we use for pasture and rangeland is either poor or very poor. And so what that means is that animals can't graze that land. Or if you're raising hay on that land, you don't get very good hay, or you may not get any hay. And so hay prices are going through the roof.
Gee.
So that's just another indicator. So if we can go to the next slide.
U.S. annual corn ending stocks.
Yeah. Now this slide shows at the end of the, okay, so
Go down a little bit. Drop it down a little bit. There you go.
every year, the when we look at crops, they typically look at the timeline of crops in what's called a crop year. And so it starts in the spring when you're planting, and it ends in the fall when there's harvest. And at the end of the year, at the end of the crop year, everything's harvested, and they can tally everything up and see how much corn do we have available to us. And so the US, what this graph shows is that, there's always going to be ups and downs in the amount of stocks that we have available for important grains like corn. Um, but what we're seeing is that the last couple of years, the stocks are starting to go down. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but the same thing's happening on a worldwide basis, too. So then we get to be a little more concerned because as the stocks go down, that means that the prices are likely to go up. Okay. And if the next slide, I think, is soybeans, and it shows a similar kind of thing. And
Yeah, these are soybean stocks.
soybean stocks,
U.S.
yeah,
annual soybean ending stock.
ending stocks, yeah.
Crop
So at the end
year.
of the year, this is what the supply is going to be. So I'm not saying this is the total supply. There's always stuff going in and out, but basically, if you want to look, what's our inventory of soybeans? This will tell you.
But something happened in 2018. Were they stocking up for some reason?
Well, that was I think probably a very good year. Okay, one thing that happens is sometimes the corn and soybeans kind of fluctuate between each other because a lot of corn and soybeans are grown on the same land. So basically, farmers might, they might grow more corn one year because they expect price to be high, and maybe stocks are. And maybe the price of soybeans is low, and so it probably what happened that year is they had a high planting and high yield. Everything just worked out really well that year.
And there might
And
have been
so,
incentives for them to have a really good planting and a really good harvest, right? Because in agriculture, there are a lot more forces on what happens other than other industries, right? Like
yeah,
corn, just you never know. Maybe there was some GMOs, maybe
yeah,
there was something going on in who knows, ethanol production that made corn more productive one year and less productive the next. There's so
mhm.
many influences on these crops
Yeah.
that
And you know what? I just remembered what it is.
hmm.
Trump's trade war. That's what it
Oh, yeah.
was. We weren't selling
It's a
soybeans
trade
to
war.
China.
Trade war.
That makes
Yeah,
sense. That makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah. But all those other variations, like you said, we have demand coming not just from consumers, but we have demand coming from processors who take soybeans and make it into soybean oil. Um, Sometimes the oil is made into diesel. Soy is used for a lot of different things, as is corn. And so there's a lot of different, um, I guess you'd say, sources of demand, sources of pressure that can be put on these
hmm
markets.
Coming from all over the
So,
place.
yeah, and that's also a good example that shows that trade is an important issue. Our agriculture is not just a U.S. Um, our U.S. agriculture is part of a world market, and
hmm
so it's the world market that sets many of these prices. Okay, so we can go to the next slide.
Fertilizer prices.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah,
This is going to be a big bump.
yeah. And so what happened was, as you know, when we invade, sorry, when when Russia invaded Ukraine, can I get this right? When
Oh,
Russia invaded Ukraine, um, one of the things that we put sanctions on Russia, and a lot of fertilizer actually comes from that part of the world. And so now fertilizer prices. So anhydrous ammonia is nitrogen. DAP, that is basically potassium, and then the other one is potash. Sorry, I'm sorry. The other one was phosphorus. The DAP is phosphorus, and the other one is potassium. And so what we see is all of the fertilizers have just jumped up in price, and so that's putting huge pressure on farmers um, in their costs. And that's something that it's hard for them to capture that unless we have government subsidies or something. So, and then yeah, we can go to the next one, Joe. And the next one actually it shows what happened in Ukraine. So Ukraine is also a factor in this because Ukraine produces 40% of the world's wheat and almost all of the world's sunflowers. Well, sunflowers, we make sunflower oil with that. And so that affects our oil supplies and the supplies of other oilseed crops like corn and soybeans. Um, and so what this actually shows, and there's different ways that the Ukrainians were impacted. Well, for one thing, a big chunk of their agricultural land is in the east, which is where Russia invaded.
Yeah, the
Um,
thing is there.
yeah. So there's a big chunk of their land that is, where there's fighting going on. And so some of the issue is that land gets destroyed. There's like 350,000 acres or hectares that have been destroyed by fire. Another thing that happens is landmines get placed. So a lot of farmers don't want to go out because they're terrified that they could step on a landmine.
Yeah.
or just people being displaced because they're in a war-torn country,
Yep,
right? And they can't go out and
yep.
plant.
And yeah, and some of them don't have the supplies. So lack of supplies is an issue. And then they have the supplies, even if they can get out and they can farm and they don't have problems, they can't get the product out because the Black Sea was blocked off.
Mhm.
And I guess they have like one railroad line that they can get things out of. So basically for Ukraine, they've lost, this table in total shows that they've lost more than $20 billion just in exports. Just in exports of these various crops that they normally would have been able to export. So, and that is a big chunk of food that is no longer available on the market. So,
Mhm.
other countries that normally would be, purchasing that, they got to find other sources for their wheat, their barley, their corn.
So can
Um,
I just put a plug in here for diplomacy real quick? All of our
Sounds good.
friends out here who are rah rah rah, let's go to war with the Russians. Don't talk to me about diplomacy. Well, here you go, folks. We can't feed ourselves.
Yep,
And
yep.
this
You're
is the stupidity that is out there.
yeah. So the situation is not just affecting gas prices; it's affecting food prices. It may not be a whole lot, but it's still affecting it. And it may not be a lot to us, but it's going to be a lot to people in other countries that don't have a lot of money.
We haven't even
So
gone
for those,
through, we haven't come through a harvest yet. You have to remember, this started in late February.
Yes.
well, they've been fighting since 2014, but but
True, but
yeah, but this worst part has been February, yeah, and so now they know a lot of the land that's not been able to be planted. and stuff.
And
So
and
they
they couldn't even ship out, even if they did have a harvest, they couldn't get it out. They couldn't get
right,
the fertilizer out of there down to Africa.
hmm
Africa was like, if we don't plant, we're going to starve.
yeah,
We don't hear about this in Western media, but
yeah,
it is very, very real.
yeah,
It's very real.
yeah.
Just like we don't hear about the fact that the Rhine has dried up and Germany now can't even get the oil that they planned on getting to themselves because a lot of it's coming down the Rhine and there is no Rhine anymore.
I didn't know about the Rhine.
Oh,
God,
yeah,
The
look it up. It's
Rhine
terrifying.
has dried up.
wow.
Okay, and
Yeah,
it's very hard for them to get ships through. Essentially, they're blocked because it's
they
dry.
can't. It's dry. And there are rocks that are being uncovered in the Rhine that are ancient that have engraved in them if you see me, if you can read this, cry, because the last time that those rocks were exposed they were in
Famine.
famine in
Mm,
Europe, and they're there again.
yeah, yeah, and a lot of these countries, that are really going to be hurting. I mean, 50% of their food of their money might go to food.
Yeah,
Well, if
Hmm.
they double the price of food, well then you know they don't have money to eat or they don't have money to live. So these are serious serious issues. So if you want to go to the next slide, Joe.
happy to do so.
Okay, and this is
Grain
just
and
a
oil crop harvest forecast for 2022.
and this is again Ukraine, and I don't know why for some reason it copied the Ukrainian letters. That first one is, I think, let's see, what was it? I think uh, oh, the first one I think is corn, then sunflower seeds, soybeans, and then the fourth one over is wheat. The fifth one is barley, and the last one is rapeseed. Yeah,
Oh, they're down on the bottom. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
And
Um,
corn,
So
sunflower.
this is the harvest.
right. This is
What do the color
well.
bars mean?
This is the current crop. And
Okay.
well, actually, what it shows is the blue is 2021, and then the green and yellow are at different points in time. Two different times they made projections based on what was already in the field,
Oh,
and
so the
so
30th of May and the
right,
5th of July. Okay,
right,
gotcha.
correct. So they saw, okay, well the corn crops looks a little better than they thought in it did in May, but the point is, it's still down like almost like 20% or something.
Yeah,
And
substantial
so
declines.
yeah, so this is showing, uh, you know, basically, even if things work out from now on, this is just basically showing the proportion of the crop of normal year's crop that Ukraine is going to get. So, okay. And then what I did was I just sort of sat down and just like did a brainstorming of a bunch of things that I
Okay, very
thought of
good.
that
Very good.
could be contributing to the multiple problems now. So what we've discussed here is in the agriculture impact, and of course, it's pretty limited agriculture impact, major crops and some livestock we've been talking about. But the U.S. of course produces many more crops, and so you know it's been a huge effect on agriculture. And then on top of it, agriculture is just one sector of the economy. And when you look at all the things, when you think of that have contributed to the supply chain problems that we're having, and just how we now operate compared to the way we used to, we've offshored jobs, we haven't maintained our infrastructure, when we have these corporate takeovers, we have mass layoffs, um, you know people who lose those jobs, they just that's skills that are lost. Um,
Amen.
and institutional knowledge of production and things like that. So
And ingenuity. The
right.
people who have the ability to do that, what they're replacing them with are lower wage yes men. I
Hmm.
mean, this is all related to why we have an inelastic supply curve,
Hmm.
right? I mean,
Well,
when you start thinking about it that way.
yeah. What we have is a very fragile system.
Hmm.
Yes.
That's exactly what it is, and that's what you yeah, that's what you're saying, Lisa. It's a very fragile system. There's no give in it. And there's no give in it because we've done all these different things. And this includes even corporate governance, which I've talked about in the past, not just in terms of antitrust, but just things like stock, stock buybacks and all kinds of things like that. And then, of course, climate
We lost you again, Sherry.
change. Here's another one. Oh, can you hear
Yeah, we
me?
can hear you now.
Okay. Here's something that I think a lot of younger people may not understand, but the three of us are old enough that we remember when this was happening. When in the 1990s, when the internet became very big, and really we saw a massive shift, to use of computers in all aspects of the economy. Well, one of the things that led to was historically companies keep inventories of stock, inventories of parts that they need, and various things like that. The internet, when it became a big thing, uh, our industry sort of switched away from maintaining inventories, which do incur costs, to what we call now just-in-time deliveries. And so that means that we don't have as much inventory available. And so, for instance, with the production of cars, and this has been a big problem, um, you know, since the pandemic. You know, you have parts coming from different, right, maybe different locations around the U.S. or even around the world. In the past, you could just order them when you're going to need them. Uh, but now you can't count on these things being delivered in time, and that creates bottlenecks. And so we're seeing this, and this is a big thing with chip manufacturing, computer chip manufacturing. So these things have contributed to the fragile nature of our supply chain, and have contributed to these many bottlenecks that end up leading to higher prices. And let's see, industry
All right. And
concentrations. There's a couple more.
the context of this is all the globalization trends
Mm-hmm. Right.
that have gone on.
That's
Okay, a
exactly right.
lot of the things that you have specified there, the parts of the list, okay, are effective or have the effects they have because of the globalization process that has been overwhelming
Mm-hmm.
everything
Yep.
since the
Yep.
1980s, okay, and 1990s.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, no one paid attention to the question uh, of whether our economy was adaptable. Uh, they were all making the assumption, in other words, they were looking at it from a global point of view. Okay, and they were saying, well, there are all these sources of supply, across the world, and look at how fast it's possible to get this supply. Okay, and we don't really need uh, to have the manufacturing sited here, and we don't really need to have the labor force to do the manufacturing here. Okay, and
Mhm.
That's because the whole world, okay, is interdependent now and all connected. And of course, the last thing they thought about was the effect, okay, of wars, okay, and the idea
Mhm.
that someday we might get ourselves into a jam with some other countries and find ourselves in a war when we're very dependent on those countries for supply.
Mhm.
And if
Yep.
we ourselves are not dependent for supply, then of course our close allies are going to be dependent for supply. And that means we have to find the supply in order to back up our, close allies. And we can't do it because the international supply chains are getting broken up and destroyed. And we
Yep.
never
Absolutely.
envisioned that. Okay, we never envisioned that. It was all short termism. Um,
Right.
as you specify here, the effect of the emphasis by the stock market on short term profits. That
Mhm.
essentially drove the businesses to, look more and more at the short term and never consider the big questions about what was happening to the system as a whole.
Correct.
There was no
Lisa.
systems analysis actually getting done at the international level.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Lisa. You're muted.
Yeah, Lisa, you're muted. Okay, we got you now. No, we still can't hear you. Your mic, okay, is unmuted, but you're not getting through for some reason. I think you'll have to go out and come in again.
Yeah. So
We may be able to hear you now, Lisa. Say something else.
Can you hear me?
We seem to hear something, but the volume is very low.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, my headphones came back on. This is so much fun. It's really important that we all kind of get. We have to put a cap on this one too. Would you explain, Joe, without defining it? It is not the job of corporations to anticipate global economic flow and feeding the country and feeding the rest of the world, or flow of energy. A corporation in and of itself, this is the big problem when you hear people saying big government is the problem. No, big government is responsible for what the short-sightedness of profits will never see. Never.
Yes, it's exactly true. Big government is not the problem. Big government, if done well, is the solution. And
And we used to do it well,
it
Joe,
is,
up until we got Milton Friedman saying that, just in time and privatization and blah, 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 blah. And then the Republicans jumped on board because God Almighty, they wanted those private contracts, right?
right.
But
Okay, and a lot of Democrats jumped on board.
oh, sure they did,
Well,
because they're reactionary, right? And they're not big picture thinkers anymore. This is why I'm going to say this one more time. I've said it before. I think that it is critical right now for a jobs program that is not just for lower level wage earners. We have to take back the ingenuity, the experience that has been forced out of the market because it's expensive, and people that have ingenuity usually have fortitude, and they try to do what is right because they consider the public purpose. Corporate America cannot do that. Why? Because they are in business to make money.
and to make
Period.
money, in the short term
Exactly.
because of the pressure
Exactly.
from Wall Street. If they're
Exactly.
part of the
yeah.
street, they have to have the profits continuously, and that
And they
means
will deregulate themselves through their bribery and their ability to buy off politicians. Everything's reactionary, everything's short term profit. There
Right.
is
Yep.
no long game anymore.
Yes, and
Right.
that's going to kill us
Yeah.
all because what we need now is the long game.
Hmm.
Yeah. I think one thing one thing that I think we really, really need, and we haven't seen that I recall in my life, is industrial policy. The federal government needs to have an industrial policy, and it should have an industrial policy with a goal of full employment. But instead, we
The idea, okay, of doing industrial policy was being
Mhm,
advocated at the beginning of the 1980s. I remember the
mhm,
books on the subject, okay, at that time. Then the Reagan administration came in and it swept it all aside. No, no industrial policy. We don't need
mhm,
industrial policy. It's the market. The market can handle everything.
right. Yeah. Well, and also basically we use our foreign policy, which is really just defense policy. Well, not even
Right,
defense. It's
right. And foreign policy
aggressive.
is foreign policy is economic policy, it's monetary policy, it's everything because our markets now are global, whether you like that or not, right?
Mhm,
But you have to have the big picture. That's why nationalism right now is so dangerous. We
mhm,
cannot become an island.
mhm,
Once a long time ago, okay, I had a discussion with Warren Mosler uh, by email. But, it was about his book, and in this discussion, he was advocating for basically free trade, no tariffs, okay, things like that. Okay, and he was putting this in the context of the MMT framework, and I said, well, from an economic point of view, that might make a lot of sense, but don't you think for certain purposes, we have to have some industries here because we might need them in case of shutting off, okay, of trade,
mhm,
but due to wars and due to other considerations. And at first, he, it was hard to get him to accept that point at the time. After a while, in our exchanges, of course, he did see it. But there's a section in the seven but deadly innocent but frauds where he's advocating basically for free trade. And in the versions of the seven deadly innocent frauds that he was putting forward at that time, this was back in 2010. Okay, uh, there was no qualification for things that might be necessary for us to have on other than purely economic grounds. I don't know if he ever changed it, in the book. Of course, I think MMTers now do recognize uh, that there are certain kinds of things that have to be, not at the base of the economy, okay, but at the base of society in general. There are certain social needs that we have to invest in, whether it makes any economic sense or not. But it was hard to get that point through to him at that time, I recall.
Well, I don't think that I don't think that it was crystal clear, Joe, until much more recently, the peril that we were in when it came to how interdependent we truly are. And Americans, a vast swath of Americans, I mean, we all know this, are just trying to make everything work at home. We were locked down during COVID. We went through 2 years of hell with all of that. It's still looming, right? Everybody's lives have dramatically changed. What people do now on a daily basis versus what they were doing in 2019 in, most of that year, the world doesn't look the same. And that's a lot of societal stress.
Yeah.
So, and then there are those of us that are paying attention to this because for whatever reason, we're all so goofy that we actually worry about this and talk about it and get on here and try and teach and open up people's horizons to how interdependent things are and why things are so difficult and relate that back to the policies that we're trying to get our government to work on, right? Like the what did they call it? The anti-inflation bill, which is really just a big corporate fossil fuel industry hooray,
Uh,
you know?
okay, I think it's the Inflation Reduction Act.
Oh yeah, whatever it is. I mean, we could have called
I,
it the Baby Diaper Act for whatever the heck that meant too. I mean, it's not going to do anything for inflation reduction. Nothing.
or very little anyway.
Yeah.
Nothing. I don't believe it. I'll believe it when I see it.
Yes,
But,
and so will
you
I.
know,
I see it.
I think though that what I'm just trying to say here is that we can't you have to be looking at the things that you know economically could cause a hiccup, right? Like back in 1990, I think it was 7, when I was in a economics class. Actually, I think I was in my controllership class. Anyway, we were doing Harvard Business Studies, and we were talking about just in time. And I remember when I went to a very small school, there was 93 in my graduating class in accounting.
Wow, that is
Um,
true.
and in my controllership class there were 11 of us, so everybody spoke their mind, we let it fly, and it was a great class. But when we were talking about how uh, just in time was the wave of the future, and this is where everything was going, and I remember saying to my professor, boy, that seems really short-sighted and very, very precarious. Well, why? It's going to save so much money. We don't have to have all this inventory sitting around, la, 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 la. Well, okay. Well, we all have seen that that wasn't going to work. But on some gut level, when you're in the big picture of business operations, things like that stick in your craw, right? I mean,
Mhm.
sure, if you're an auditor and you're only looking at it from the standpoint of, wow, I don't have to worry so much about inventory control. And, because there's not going to be so much inventory unless you're in an inventory heavy industry, right? Like you're printing and you've got to go and count the reams of paper that are strung through the machines. But on the whole, when you're talking about operations and you hear, well, we're not going to hold inventory, and if and I had done this, I'd been out auditing, and when back before there were shortages, if you were in an industry where something got stuck somewhere, you could fold because you couldn't get a part that you desperately needed to fill an order for a client that was the federal government,
Mhm.
that, this is 25% of our income, this one order this year, and we can't get the cylinder that we need to make the transformer. Now what? Right? We're going under.
Mhm.
That's what just in time did.
Yes.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, and it's been doing it also increasingly during the current time when we've had the supply chain disruptions.
Hmm.
If businesses can't get key things they need, and if there's no buffer stock anywhere,
Right. Or
that
if you do something like a blockade and you can't get the stuff, whether it's there or not, duh,
Mhm.
sanctions.
Yeah.
Woohoo, everybody.
Yeah. Well, and also, for a while we had um, how many, tens and tens or dozens of ships out in the ocean waiting
Hmm.
to be able to unload. Or you have and that's another thing, big ships, the ships are getting bigger, and some of our ports are not able to handle these big ships.
Yeah.
And we had a
And it
ship.
happened all up and down the supply chain.
Hmm. Yep.
right?
Yep.
You had truckers dropping their, what do you call them, containers outside of ports because they couldn't get into the ports, right? So they were just
Hmm.
leaving them on the sides of the roads.
Hmm.
Now you don't have the supply chain custody because they aren't
Hmm.
in the places that they needed
Hmm.
to be cataloged,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Right.
And trains,
Yeah.
the same thing.
Yeah.
How many rail cars did you see that were getting raided in the couple of cities that, the rail cars were just sitting and they were
Hmm.
ripe for the picking,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It was
Because
all
one
over.
of the things that because we had we had these sanctions with the, I mean, yeah, we had these trade issues with China, but then we also had some climate problems, and so what one of the things that we typically have done with um, the, uh, the big containers that come over is they come over from China or wherever, they unload all their stuff, and then what a lot of what was done was, they might fill them back up with soybeans, and so when people aren't working or when there's a climate, a crop failure problem or whatever, we did have a period of time where there was a real mismatch with the containers. They ended up having to just ship a lot of them back just empty.
Right.
So,
Right.
but that's
You had shrinkage in your supply chain of inventory. And I was speaking to this a long time ago and nobody picked up on it. But shrinkage, right? Let me just tie this all together. When they were saying that there was so much shoplifting going on, right? I think that was a big scapegoat for inventory shrinkage because
mhm,
depending on what your FOB is, free on board, which just basically means when do you take custody of your inventory? Do you take custody of
yeah,
your inventory when it lands on your dock? In
mhm,
other words, that's when you've got to pay for it. That's when it's counted. A lot of industry now forces the receiving entity to take FOB once it leaves their dock.
mm,
Well, you know how much shrinkage was out there
mm.
because nobody knew where the inventory was?
Huh.
And
Yes,
you
it
didn't
was.
hear about that publicized at all over the last year and a half. Not
Mhm.
one peep.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
enormous.
So what I wanted to do was, I mean, of course, I mostly talked about agriculture, but we've also been talking about other stuff too, and I think hopefully people can see that, a lot of these same things that that agriculture has been dealing with, every sector in the country and around the world has been dealing with these things. So we have these problems, these many problems that come about because of just decades of ignoring problems within the supply chain, thinking that we had solutions to things that really weren't maybe the best solutions, like just in time delivery, things like that. And we have this all
So
over. And so,
to kind of summarize, what you're saying is that when you look at the ground causes, the micro
mhm,
causes, the
mhm,
inflation we're having now is a multi-causal phenomenon.
Hmm.
exactly.
In other words, we can say that there's uh, there's price gouging, there's supply chain disruption, there's there's war.
Hmm.
And to talk about those things, uh, okay, is and only those things at a macro level is to mask all of the more basic causes that occurred at a micro level.
Hmm.
And your list is
Hmm.
pointing to those causes.
Hmm.
And it's one thing to summarize them at a high level with the price gouging idea or the supply chain idea, okay, or the war idea, but that doesn't get into the nitty gritty of what has to be fixed to end inflation.
Exactly.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because what we got to do is we got to address those issues. And it's going to, we had, that list of 14 points or whatever, these are things that
But
we need to deal with.
consolidation, I'm sorry.
Mhm,
I just think that it's really important that, like, if I were to start on that list,
mhm,
antitrust, the consolidation is what started all of this, right? And why do you consolidate? Because you can get bigger and bigger profits, right? I mean, that is really
mhm,
why you do those types of things. You disseminate or decimate your competitors, you
mhm,
scarf up the market share, you have inelastic
mhm,
supply, right? And you
mhm,
just price
mhm,
out demand, price it
mhm.
out.
Yep.
And there is a swath there where they hit that sweet spot. They can lay off more people, right? They've got the
Mhm.
cash reserves. Guess what? Higher interest rates, who benefits from that? People with cash reserves, right? And
Yep.
all of us little people sitting down here are like, hey, wait a minute. We're going to starve Europe. We potentially are going to be in a world of hurt, whether we starve or we fry or we run out of drinking water or whatever it is, right?
Mm.
But what we do not have is a public purpose consciousness because we have allowed privatization and consolidation of corporations to
Mhm.
rule us.
Right.
That's really how we got here.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
And we, as individuals, have really kind of absorbed a lot of that thinking. And so we don't really see how wrong a lot of this stuff is. You know, I
Hmm.
talk to, I talk to my colleagues who are like younger people, and I'll talk to them about some things, and they don't even get why I'm upset, you know,
No.
because because everything seems fine.
Well,
you know.
because Americans really are in a rat race right now, right? And this is part of the reason why it's so concerning to me when I see how authoritarian and authoritative and fascistic rise all around us, right?
Yeah.
Because when things get chaotic, people are drawn to something orderly, right?
Also drawn to simple solutions
Mhm.
they don't have to
Yep.
think very deeply about. And of course, the authoritarians are very good at producing simple slogans that
Mhm.
people can latch onto as answers, which really are not answers to anything at all.
Well,
Mhm.
deregulation
Yep.
happened subtly, happened through not funding governmental agencies, through you know propaganda campaigns to make those agencies look bad, and
Yeah.
then of course you get the politicization of just narratives so that you can win an election as a
Mhm.
party, right? which is
Mhm.
which is the epitome of, I don't know how you turn the ship around, truthfully, when you would rather uh allow a narrative to go on for days in the corporate media, weeks at this point, about certain agencies, or be it movements, or whatever it is, right? And you just allow people to formulate opinions about certain groups of people or certain agencies of the government or government as a whole, and because division is a ruling tactic, right?
Mhm.
But the DNC isn't concerned about anything but winning an election. They don't care what policies get passed per se. The DNC itself in a midterm election year is concerned about one thing and one thing only: winning the damned election. And if that means we're going to tear apart the societal trust and the interfabric of society itself, they don't
Mhm.
seem to get it,
Yeah.
right? Whatever it takes to win that election.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I don't know how we pull this back,
I don't
not
either.
without a real leader.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we know that we have to pull it back by changing the political system in a very, very gross way. Okay. In other words, it has to be a disturbance. It has to be something that really bothers the powers that be.
Well, our side isn't doing a good enough job. Liz Cheney just lost.
I understand Liz Cheney just lost, but also Liz Cheney is probably going to run for president now.
Well, I know, but that's not the point, Joe. I think that what I'm trying to say here is that there is a disturbance going on.
There is
It's
a
just not
disturbance
happening
going
on
on,
our side.
but we need a disturbance of our own, and our disturbance has to replace people in the Congress wholesale because it really does begin with them. They have to be willing to reject the money. They have to be willing to get the donors out of there to make their money non consequential in shaping the political system.
Yeah. But how do we get over the noise?
I don't know how we go over the noise, but I know we got to keep trying to get over the noise. We have to keep trying to get people to see this very simple point that if the representatives are going to continue to represent only the donors, we're all going to die. We have to have a political system where the public purpose, okay, is the goal of those who get elected to Congress. And the only way we can see to that, okay, is to make sure that those who serve the donors are defeated. It's the only way that that's going to happen. Oh, or there's also the other way it can happen. It can happen, through a bloody revolution, and then a lot of other things, okay, are going to happen, and they are not necessarily going to be good things for us, okay, because in a way, if rising fascism wins, then even if it wins at the ballot box, then the revolution that's going to occur, okay, is going to be bloody because a whole bunch of us are going to go into the camps. I mean, I think we know that.
Yeah, or we're going to end up in World War III and everybody's going to, we're not going to recognize what we've got left and we'll have to climb out of that.
Yeah. So I think we have to be real tough about the Dump the Incumbents campaign. We have to keep trying to get it off the ground.
Well, I think it's a good idea, Joe.
It is a good idea. I mean, we've been working on it, but what I'm trying to get at is that the more people we can get to realize that getting angry at one another over stupid narratives that are coming out every other news cycle,
It doesn't make
right,
any sense.
is just us, they've got us right where they want us, going down the drain.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's true. Okay. By the way, tomorrow night, uh, well, I shouldn't say first tomorrow night, but actually present the problem. We know the world is changing, that the economic war, okay, and the Ukraine war, okay, is changing. What's happening is the development of a multipolar system.
Hmm.
We know that that is happening. Also know that not many people are thinking about what does the United States do as we develop a multipolar system. And I think we have to talk about that. We have to talk about uh, the areas of the world that we're not likely to have a lot of control over because they're not going to be a part, okay, of our pole. The areas of the world where we may have had allies, very strong allies, but where in the near future we may not have very strong allies at all, because the devastation that's coming up over in Europe is likely to detach quite a few of the European allies from the United States. I mean, how can they get through the winter if they can't get through the winter without the collapse of their economies? They're going to have to give in and look to the Russians for the supplies that they need. There really isn't an alternative for them.
I don't even think they have to give in. They have to give up on this craziness
Yeah, they
that
have.
allowed them to get into this situation.
Yes, they have to give up on the craziness. They have to give up on the sanctions, and they have to begin to trade with Russia, okay, and the other people who supplied them before. And they have to realize that the terms of trade at the beginning are not going to be very good for them because of the
What
disruption
are
of
we
war,
gonna do?
their
I mean,
support of the United States. What are we going to do? We have to tend to our knitting, I think. Uh, what I mean by that is we have a lot of countries that, over the years, we have been just treating terribly, that are in this hemisphere with us, that are our natural partners. We have to begin to retreat, to treat them with respect,
Mhm.
and we have to begin to treat those other nations, okay, as equals, and we have to offer them favorable terms, okay, of trade, and we have to look out for them. The pink tide in Latin America, okay, is rising again. I mean, if Lula wins, okay, in just a few months, that's going to mean that most of Latin America is now going to be strongly inclined towards socialism.
hmm
And we need to accommodate ourselves to that. We need to accept it. We have to work with the socialist countries so that they can be prosperous and we can be prosperous. We have to allow them to develop their potential. We have to change our foreign policy really totally.
Yeah, we do. We have to get our heads in the game because we cannot function as an island.
And we have to understand who are going to be our close collaborators in our pole, because we're going to have, okay, a multipolar world. And given the size of our population and our
We already
economic
do have one,
potential, uh, we are going to be a major player in one of the poles.
or we're not.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
worried about us not being a major player at this point.
yes.
If
Okay,
we do
so
not get
right,
off this
when I
tack,
say we have to be a major player, what I'm saying is we have to create and nourish
hmm
the pole that we are, that we are a part of, and we have to recognize that there has to be a collaborative approach to that pole to make everybody happy, because the Chinese are in there as well. The Russians are in certain areas, and they're going to treat the other nations in what could be our pole very well. And we're going to have to treat them at least as well in response. And the sooner we can begin to do that, the better off we're going to be. And I thought that might be an appropriate thing for us to talk about tomorrow. Okay, the topic of the U.S. In a multipolar world. What will the position of the U.S. be, in a multipolar world? What should it be? What it might be if we follow the right policies, and what it might be if we follow the wrong policies.
It'll be a very, very good conversation, Joe, because I'm going to make an outline because I've just got a bunch of things just pop into my head.
Okay. Would you like to join us for that, Sherry?
Yeah, would you?
Um, I don't know. I'll have to talk to my husband and see if I can or not. Because usually this is kind of our private time. I mean, our couple time. But yeah, I'll talk to him and see.
Even if you can only come for a little bit, you don't have to stay
Yeah.
for the whole thing.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that. I can
Okay.
show up for a little while.
Okay, that would be great then. So, but by the way, thank you for tonight. I think you
Sure.
did an
Yes,
excellent
very much.
job of making your points. Okay, I thought the detail was great. It
Good.
drive home, but drove home the main points very, very well. And I think the discussion was a great one. So
Yeah.
thank you,
It
Sherry.
was. It
Well,
was
thank
great.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. You both really made this a much better conversation too.
Well,
So
you did it. You brought the topic. You got the discussion going. You had the graphs, and we just like
Yeah,
fill in.
right.
and now whenever somebody says to me, um, there isn't any such thing as inflation or whatever, now I
Uh,
can say, watch Joe's video.
there you go. Right.
That's right.
That's great. It's great to see you, Sherry.
Oh,
So
good to
good to
see you
see
too,
you.
Lisa. Take care. So, do we have any questions that we need to address?
We have, there weren't really too many questions. There were comments of various kinds. I can sort of go back and page through very quickly. Uh, my phone shows four other people in the chat, but my tablet only shows me. I don't know what that's about. Let's see. Somebody mentioned, of course, that Liz Cheney lost. Of course, we were all expecting that. She was behind in the polling by what was it, 21
3 points.
points or something like that. There was no way to make that up. Uh, but someone did make a comment about that. So Brandy says we have 7 cats now. Lisa, I feel you.
Oh, 7. I can't do 7. I'm barely hanging on with 1 and 2 kittens.
Jeff Denton said, my youngest grandson almost died the other night because it's not profitable for hospitals to treat children. What the hell is that about, Jeff?
Oh, it's
That's
awful.
incredible. Hospitals won't treat children.
I saw a statistic that like 93 million or 97 million, it's either 93 or 97 million people put off healthcare
Yeah.
treatment because they just couldn't afford it last year.
Okay, I think we need to start by essentially nationalizing all the hospitals and follow that quickly by nationalizing the pharmaceutical companies.
Sounds good to me.
We could nationalize it or we can make a new tax designation. I talked about this before, and we give the profession to the doctors. And they can't be lobbyists. They can't
Ah,
ever have been lobbyists. They have to be practicing professional physicians, administrative, fine, but they
mhm.
have to be hospital administrators and researchers that are doing the research, not everybody else who's on the take on the peripheral. If you
Mhm.
allow them their own tax designation to run the industry, and then we can nationalize the brick and mortar so that we can supplement the brick and mortar, right? And then you can make it part of the darn, jobs program.
Yeah.
Hire back the nurses, put
Yeah.
hours in play, put standards around how many patients to how many nurses and how many aides and what your operations teams need to look like. The whole thing.
Okay, so
Mhm.
Lisa,
Hmm.
we should have a program on that too.
That
You know
sounds
what? That
good.
would be a great one.
A
That
whole
would be a
program
great one.
devoted to that, like the in-depth show next week.
That would be a great idea.
So let's keep that idea, okay, in mind. Note it down so we do not actually forget it,
Okay.
because that would be great for next week. We can explore it, okay, in detail.
Yeah, because we cannot continue to leave the corporations to run stuff.
No.
No,
That's how we got here.
that's how we got here. We cannot leave them to run stuff. All they care about is nonprofit. Okay? By the way, if we're not going to nationalize these industries, we have to, in many cases, return. Well, I shouldn't say in many cases, but there was one time when hospitals were largely nonprofit,
Yeah.
and we have to go back to that.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
yeah, yes and no, because nonprofit is nothing more than a tax designation anymore. All it means is you don't get taxed on your profits, and you can, if you're a hospital, you can say that you are, you get the tax designation easy enough. But again, with the industry owning the brick and mortar, owning the insurance underwriting, owning the hospital staff, contracting them, distribution line, right? They're serving themselves
Mhm.
with a nonprofit designation.
well, I'm not saying that alone, okay, is enough to change the situation. I mean, I take your point that we need to have the hospitals being run by the doctors again. That is very, very important. So I think that there's more than one or two or three things that we have to do to change the health industrial complex. Okay, it's going to be a number of things, but one of them is surely no profits.
Well, if you nationalize it, right? If you nationalize the brick and mortar, just like what they've done with the brick and mortar now is that the equity firms have come in and bought up the real estate, right? If
Yeah,
you nationalize that, then it doesn't need a nonprofit tax designation, right?
I don't know. I haven't thought that through as to see whether it needs a nonprofit tax designation.
I am in this big place where if you enable the ingenuity and the prowess of those that are healers and those that are treaters of human beings that took that Hippocratic oath and you give them back the realm, it's going to go boom. We will be the greatest country for medical care again. We will be,
Okay,
unequivocally.
I that is very attractive to me. Okay, and I believe, okay, as you do, that something like that, okay, is going to happen. However, we used to be like that,
Hmm.
and we evolved into this profit-making monster in the health industrial complex. And one of the ways in which we evolved into it was that they became profit-making entities. So it seems to me that's one of the things we have to take care of in trying to change things. We have to take the profit incentives out of it.
Yeah, we have to dismantle the ACA,
Yes.
basically.
Oh, definitely. We have to man.
I mean, that's what did it. That's really what messed it up
Oh, really?
on steroids.
Yeah. Even vet clinics now are owned by private equity.
Yep. Yep. Indeed. And then the way that they treat the animals now, I mean, it's ugh.
Yeah.
I don't my dog does not need a flu shot. Sorry, Veterinarian Association of America. My dog's not getting a flu shot. Anyway, I love you guys. It's 11:10. I'm going to sign off if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. I think the rest of us are going to sign off too. We got a comment, okay, from Lana Dell, which is Lisa. I forgot to say on the phone, Gene and I would like to discuss a Red Beret in Minnesota group. Yeah, a Red Beret in Minnesota group. Great idea.
I think that's great. Awesome.
Okay, Brandy says to nationalize the pharmaceuticals. I'm for it, and I'll work for a pharmacy.
Yeah, you know what? I would love to. I would get back in healthcare if it was nationalized.
Hmm.
But I'm not touching it the way it is now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand completely.
So, well, I enjoyed this conversation.
And so did I. And good night to both of you. And I will send you links for tomorrow.
Okay.
Good
And
night, everybody. Thank you, Dolores.
thank you, Joe, for letting me babble.
You know what?
No,
Sherry, please come babble more. Enlighten us. Don't call it babble. It's not babble. It's exactly
Economy
what
speak.
needs to happen.
yes.
So,
Okay,
anyway.
so tomorrow.
All right. Yeah. So,
we'll
I'll come on
trouble
tomorrow.
again.
Same time, same place. Bye, guys.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
good night, Lisa. And good night,